welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we're going to be exploring something that's not really talked about that often.
Yeah.
Sex and love addiction.
It's definitely one of those things that people kind of, shy away from, but it's more prevalent than we realize.
For sure. And to really get into it today, we're going to be diving into 2 audio files from Sex and Love Addiction Anonymous, or as it's known, SLAA.
Okay.
And these meetings that we're listening to feature a lot of personal stories and insights into what healthy relationships can look like after recovery.
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear people talk about how they navigate intimacy and connection after experiencing addiction.
Yeah, so before we get too far, can you give us a little bit of background on exactly what SLA is?
Sure. So SLAA is a 12-step fellowship.
Okay.
It's kind of in the same vein as Alcoholics Anonymous, but specifically designed for people who are struggling with sex and love addiction.
And I think when people hear love addiction, they're like, wait, can you really be addicted to love?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
Yeah.
And one of the things that comes up in these meetings is that it's not so much about being addicted to love itself, but more like using romantic intensity or even the chase as a way to cope with underlying emotional pain or, just using it to...
Things that you're not dealing with.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's more about the process and the feelings involved than the actual love itself.
Gotcha. Okay, so in these SLAA meetings, they use a really interesting analogy to talk about relationships.
Oh, okay.
They compare them to energy systems.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting. It was a great way to kind of visualize it.
Yeah, can you explain that a little bit more? I'm not sure I totally understand what that means.
Sure. So they talk about open and closed systems.
Okay.
So imagine a closed relationship system as like a spaceship with a limited fuel supply. Both people rely entirely on each other for their sense of worth and identity.
Okay.
So it creates this closed loop where no outside energy is allowed in.
So they're completely codependent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that can make it really fragile.
Yeah.
Because let's say person A in this relationship decides they want to go back to school.
Okay.
In a closed system, person B might see that as a threat to their security and react with jealousy or fear.
Yeah, because it disrupts that totally codependent system they've built.
It upsets that equilibrium.
Yeah.
Now, on the other hand, imagine an open system.
Okay.
This is more like a plant.
Okay.
Drawing nourishment from the sun, the rain, the soil, even other plants around it.
So it's getting all of this.
It's taking in everything.
Yeah. Okay. I see where you're going with this.
Right. So in an open system, both partners can draw energy and fulfillment from sources outside the relationship.
Gotcha.
So going back to school wouldn't be seen as this big threat. Right. Because person B has their own independent sources of growth and happiness.
So it's like, in a weird way, encouraging individual growth strengthens the relationship.
That's exactly it.
Interesting.
It's about thriving on personal development, not codependence.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's not just about romantic relationships.
Right.
They talk a lot about choosing to live alone in these meetings, especially in early recovery.
Yeah, that was a really fascinating perspective. It's not about avoiding relationships altogether. It's about learning to be content and finding fulfillment in a life that doesn't solely revolve around romantic partnerships.
So it's like you're building that foundation within yourself first.
Exactly. And they use this really great analogy of living in a clean house.
Okay.
You can enjoy that sense of peace and order.
Yeah.
And not feel the need to constantly invite visitors in.
Just to fill the space.
Exactly.
Yeah, I love that. But they also acknowledge that there are some downsides to living alone, right?
Oh, for sure. You don't want to swing too far in the other direction.
Right.
And become isolated.
Become a hermit.
Right. It's about finding that balance.
Yeah.
Living alone doesn't have to mean shutting yourself off from the world.
Right.
It's about choosing to focus on yourself and finding purpose and meaning outside of romantic relationships.
So like building strong friendships, pursuing your interests, getting involved in service to others, things like that.
Exactly. Create a life that you don't need to escape from.
Yeah, I love that. Okay. So that brings us to a really intense topic that comes up in these meetings.
Okay.
Reconciliation projects.
Yeah, reconciliation projects are basically attempts to rebuild a relationship after addiction has caused some damage. As you can imagine,
I bet it's difficult.
Yeah, fraught with challenges.
They're like navigating a minefield of past hurts and resentments.
Exactly. They talk about how you can encounter everyday situations that trigger memories of past betrayals. Even something as simple as having different sexual rhythms within the couple
Okay.
can lead to all sorts of misunderstandings and conflict.
Wow. So I imagine communication is key in these situations.
Oh,
But
absolutely.
easier said than done, I'm sure.
It's not easy. Both partners have to be incredibly vulnerable
Yeah.
and willing to openly share their feelings without blaming each other.
Right.
It's also remembering that they're both struggling and trying to heal.
Yeah, for sure. One of the speakers uses this really powerful image
Okay.
to describe this whole process.
Yeah.
They talk about green shoots reaching for the sunlight on an old battlefield.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's pretty intense.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, and it really emphasizes the importance of forgiveness and choosing to see each other as allies, not enemies.
Right. You're in this together.
Right, yeah. And then speaking of new beginnings,
Okay.
the source material also goes into the complexities of starting new relationships after addiction.
That's kind of a double-edged sword. You have the excitement of a fresh start,
Right.
but you also run the risk of falling back
Yeah.
into those old, unhealthy patterns.
And you mentioned earlier that addiction is often about using external things to cope with internal pain.
Right.
So I imagine that could easily spill over
Absolutely.
into these new relationships.
Yeah, there's this tendency to project this heroic self-image in new relationships.
Interesting.
Like we want to be loved for this
Yeah.
idealized version of ourselves rather than who we truly are.
It's like you're wearing a mask.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Trying to hide all those vulnerabilities and insecurities that we haven't fully dealt with.
Right, but true intimacy requires taking off the mask
Absolutely.
and being genuinely known.
Yeah.
And I imagine that can be terrifying after experiencing addiction,
Oh, for sure.
that fear of rejection.
Yeah. But it's also incredibly liberating to finally let go of that facade and experience a true connection.
Yeah, for sure. And they talk about the initial hesitation or uncertainty around sex in these new relationships, especially after struggling with compulsive behaviors.
Yeah. It makes sense that sex would be approached differently in this context.
Yeah.
It becomes less about instant gratification and more about building that genuine emotional connection first.
Right.
Open communication is really essential here.
Yeah.
Being able to talk about your fears, your boundaries, what you need to feel safe and respected.
For sure. So before we dive into the personal stories shared in these SLAA meetings, just to kind of recap, what are some of the key concepts that we've covered so far?
So we talked about SLA as a fellowship,
Right.
the difference between open and closed relationship systems.
Right.
And we touched on the challenges of navigating relationships after addiction, whether it's through reconciliation projects or new partnerships.
Right. It's a lot to unpack, but I feel like these ideas give us a really good foundation for understanding these personal experiences we're about to hear.
Absolutely. And I think you'll find that these stories offer some really powerful insights into the nature of addiction, the process of recovery, and the transformative power of finding connection and support within a fellowship like SLAA.
I'm ready. I have a feeling these stories are going to be pretty powerful.
They are. So the first one we're going to hear is from a woman who recounts her struggle with food, alcohol, and sex addiction.
Wow.
And she talks about kind of hitting rock bottom and ultimately finding SLAA as a source of hope and healing.
It's amazing how interconnected those different forms of addiction can be.
It really is. And she has this really relatable quote about her food addiction. She says, "I would die and dream of being thin, as if thinness would suddenly make me witty and confident and beautiful."
Yeah, it speaks to that like desperate search for external validation.
Yeah.
How addiction can really distort our perception of ourselves.
Absolutely. But despite all that desperation, she finds this glimmer of hope.
Okay.
And she has another great quote where she talks about surrendering to a higher power.
Okay.
She says, "All that was needed was for me to open the door a bit wider with willingness, and a power greater than myself would make possible that which I could not do alone."
So it's like letting go of control and allowing something bigger than yourself to guide you.
Exactly.
Wow, I like that.
Yeah.
And that sense of surrender is something that we see come up again and again in a lot of these stories.
It's a common thread.
Yeah. So the next story we're going to hear is from a man who shares his journey from childhood abuse to a life of compulsive cruising.
Wow.
And ultimately finding solace in sobriety and the fellowship of SLA.
It's a powerful story.
Yeah. And it really underscores the impact of early trauma.
Yeah.
And how addiction can become this coping mechanism
Right.
for unprocessed pain.
Absolutely.
And also how societal stigma and homophobia can compound those struggles.
For sure.
Yeah. There's this line in his story that really struck me. He says, I was 24 gay living in Mecca, discovering the bars and bathhouses.
Wow.
And it paints such a vivid picture of that time and place.
It does.
But it also hints at this underlying loneliness.
Right.
And that search for connection that often fuels addiction.
Yeah. It's a powerful image.
Yeah. And even in the midst of that search, there's this yearning for something more.
Right.
He says at one point, the songs on the radio bore me out.
Wow.
It speaks to that sense of emptiness and disillusionment that can come with chasing those fleeting pleasures.
Yeah, I think a lot of people can relate to that feeling.
For sure.
Searching for something, but not quite knowing what it is.
Yeah. So the last story we're going to hear in this part of our deep dive comes from a woman who details her experience with love addiction, growing up with overprotective parents,
Okay.
and the ongoing struggle to establish healthy boundaries in relationships.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is.
It's amazing how those early family dynamics can shape our relationship patterns
They really do.
and how difficult it can be to break free from those ingrained behaviors.
And she has this really insightful observation about her patterns in relationships.
Okay.
She says, I realized that I was saying the same thing to each of them. Although I was being honest, I was developing my rap. It speaks to that unconscious repetition
Yeah.
of unhealthy patterns, even when we think we're being genuine.
It's like we're stuck in a loop,
Yeah.
playing out the same script over and over again.
Exactly. It makes you wonder, what does it take to break free from that?
It's a great question, and it's something that we'll continue to explore as
Yeah.
we delve deeper into these stories and the principles of SLAA.
Awesome. I'm excited to keep going.
Me too.
All right, let's do it.
Okay.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're continuing our exploration of Sex and Love Addiction Anonymous through these powerful audio recordings from actual SLAA meetings.
Yeah, and as we go through these personal stories, I think you'll see this recurring theme
Okay.
of isolation.
Oh, interesting.
Even when these individuals were surrounded by people, addiction created this barrier to genuine connection.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's like they were living in two separate worlds.
Yeah.
Like with that woman who was struggling with food, alcohol, and sex addiction.
Right.
She mentioned feeling like an outsider in her own family,
Yeah.
even though she had a seemingly normal upbringing.
It really challenges our assumptions about addiction.
Yeah.
You know, it shows that it's not just about willpower or morality.
Right.
There's often this deep-seated emotional pain that's driving these compulsive behaviors.
Right. And she talked about using those addictions as a way to numb those feelings.
Right, to try and fill that void.
Yeah. And in that story about the man who experienced childhood abuse,
Yeah.
he mentioned discovering that he had something that other people wanted.
Right.
It was really empowering and heartbreaking at the same time.
Yeah, that really resonated with me too. It speaks to that early yearning for validation and affection,
Yeah.
but it gets distorted into this pattern of seeking it through sexual encounters.
Right. And he even described his first sexual experience as feeling hooked from that moment on,
Wow.
which really highlighted how vulnerable we are at a young age.
Yeah.
And how those early experiences can have such a lasting impact on our relationship with sex and intimacy.
It's like those early experiences create a blueprint
Yeah.
for how we navigate intimacy later in life.
Right.
And if those experiences were traumatic or unhealthy,
Right.
it can be incredibly difficult to break free from those patterns.
Yeah. And as he got older, those patterns continued to escalate.
Right.
He became incredibly skilled at finding opportunities for anonymous sex, even while maintaining a seemingly normal life.
Right. He used this really interesting analogy.
Okay.
He compared it to an alcoholic being able to sense a drink a mile away.
Wow.
You really captures that intensity of the craving
Right.
and the way addiction can completely take over.
It's almost like a sixth sense.
Right. A hyper-awareness
Yeah.
of opportunities to engage in the addictive behavior.
And he talked about never really connecting with the person behind the genitals.
Yeah, that points to that lack of genuine intimacy despite engaging in so many sexual encounters.
It's like he was chasing a feeling, but never quite reaching it.
That's a really good way to put it. I think it speaks to that emptiness
Right.
that lies at the heart of addiction.
Yeah.
It's this constant search for something that can never truly be satisfied
Right.
through external means.
I wonder if that fear of rejection plays a role too.
Possibly.
Like maybe there's this underlying belief that they're not worthy of love or connection
Right.
unless they're performing sexually.
That's a really interesting point.
Ah,
And it ties into that concept we talked about earlier,
okay.
the heroic self-image.
Right.
It's that need to project a certain image
Right.
to feel acceptable and lovable.
So it's like they're building a wall around themselves to protect themselves from getting hurt.
Yeah, but in the process,
Yeah.
they're preventing true intimacy.
Right. And in that third story, we heard the woman talked about growing up with overprotective parents
Right?
and how that impacted her ability to form healthy relationships.
It's fascinating how those early family dynamics
Right.
can shape our attachment styles and
Yeah.
how we approach intimacy.
Her parents' anxieties and restrictions around sex
Yeah,
kind of created this sense that it was something shameful.
right. It had to be hidden.
Yeah, it's like they unintentionally created this forbidden fruit scenario.
Exactly. And it led to her compartmentalizing her life,
Right.
keeping her sexual experiences separate from her home life.
So she was living a double life.
Right.
And then she developed this pattern of seeking validation through affairs.
Right.
Like she needed that external confirmation
Yeah.
to feel worthy.
That's a classic example of love addiction.
Right.
That intense need for romantic intensity.
Yeah.
And the emotional highs and lows that come with it.
She even talked about feeling energized
Really?
by the chaos of juggling multiple relationships,
Wow.
almost like it was an addiction in itself.
It's like she was addicted to the drama,
Yeah.
the adrenaline rush.
Right. It gave her a sense of control, even though it was ultimately self-destructive.
Right. And it goes back to that idea of addiction being about filling a void.
Yeah.
Maybe that need for chaos and intensity was her way of trying to fill that emptiness.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
And eventually, as with most addictions,
Right.
that facade started to crumble.
Yeah.
She started to recognize the emptiness of these encounters
Right.
and the toll it was taking on her life.
It's like that moment of self-awareness
Yeah.
that's so crucial in any recovery journey.
It's like waking up and realizing you've been sleepwalking through life.
Exactly.
Wow.
And for her, it was realizing that she was repeating the same patterns,
Right.
saying the same things to each new partner.
Right.
That was a pivotal moment for her. It was that flicker of self-awareness that can be the catalyst for change.
Right. And that's where SLAA comes in.
Right.
And provides that safe space to confront those patterns, to find support and connection with others who understand.
Exactly. It's about breaking down that isolation,
Right.
realizing that you're not alone,
Right.
and beginning that journey toward healing.
It sounds like SLAA gives you this roadmap
Yeah.
for navigating all these incredibly complex emotions and behaviors.
It does. It offers tools and a framework for
Wow.
understanding and addressing those issues.
So the next part of our deep dive, we're going to explore the specific tools and strategies that
Yeah.
SLAA offers for recovery and how these individuals navigate the ongoing challenges
Okay.
of building healthy relationships.
Sound good.
I'm really curious to hear about that.
Okay.
It seems like SLAA goes beyond just abstinence
It does.
and really gets into the deeper emotional and psychological aspects of recovery.
We'll talk about the importance of honesty, accountability, and self-care,
Okay.
and how those principles can guide the path toward lasting sobriety and
Right.
fulfilling connection.
I'm ready. Let's keep going.
Okay, so we're back for the last part of our deep dive into sex and love addiction.
Right.
It's been really powerful hearing these personal stories from SLAA meetings.
Yeah, very raw and honest.
Yeah, I'm really struck by just how much we can learn
Right.
from hearing other people talk about their struggles and triumphs.
It speaks to the power of vulnerability and shared experience.
For sure.
Like they say, you're only as sick as your secrets.
Right, and sharing those secrets in a safe and supportive environment
Yeah.
can be incredibly healing.
You can.
I'm really curious to hear more about what recovery looks like for these individuals, because it seems like it goes way beyond just abstaining from the addictive behaviors.
Yeah, it really does. What's interesting is how these individuals describe recovery as this fundamental shift
Okay.
in their perspective and their way of relating to the world.
Oh, wow.
They talk about feeling whole and centered for the first time.
Like they finally found that sense of inner peace and fulfillment.
That they were seeking through their addictions.
They've stopped running from themselves
Right.
and started to embrace who they truly are.
Yeah, I remember in one of the stories, the woman described feeling released into hope
Oh, wow.
after attending her first SLAA meeting.
Yeah.
It's like a weight had been lifted and she could finally see a path forward.
That sense of hope is so powerful.
Yeah.
And she also talked about the importance of surrender in that recovery process.
Okay.
It's not about white-knuckling it or relying solely on willpower.
Right.
It's acknowledging that you need help
Yeah.
and being open to receiving that support.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like admitting you can't do it alone
Right.
and being willing to lean on others for guidance and strength.
Exactly. And that kind of goes against how we're often conditioned to deal with problems.
Right.
We're told to be strong and independent.
Right.
But sometimes the strongest thing you can do is ask for help.
Yeah, for sure. And in another story, the man talked about finally being able to get to know people as I have never known them before.
Right.
Which really shows how addiction can create this barrier
He does.
to true intimacy.
Yeah.
It's like he was finally able to see people as individuals,
Right.
not just objects to fulfill his needs.
Just...
And that allowed him to connect on a much deeper level.
Absolutely.
And the woman who shared her experience with a love addiction and overprotective parents talked about the tools of the program being really essential to her recovery.
I'd love to hear more about that. What were some of those tools?
She didn't really go into specifics,
Okay.
but she did mention that the 12 steps provided this framework
Right.
for self-reflection, accountability, and spiritual growth.
So it's not just about stopping the behavior.
Right.
It's about addressing those underlying issues that drive those behaviors.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
about getting to the root of the problem,
Mhm.
not just treating the symptoms.
Exactly.
She also talked about a shift in her decision-making process. It's no longer, what can I get away with?
Right.
But what can I do that's going to help me in my spiritual recovery?
That's huge.
Yeah. And it speaks to this newfound sense of self-respect
Yeah.
and a commitment to living in alignment with her values.
Absolutely.
So I think these stories really show us that recovery is an ongoing process.
Yeah. It's not a quick fix.
No, it's a journey
It's a journey.
with ups and downs, temptations, moments of doubt.
For sure.
And they talked about slips and dry drunks
Right.
and the importance of having a support system
Yeah.
to help them through those challenging times.
Absolutely. It's like learning anything new.
Right.
There are going to be bumps along the road.
It's like learning to ride a bike.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're going to fall a few times before you find your balance.
Right. But the key is to not give up.
Right. Keep getting back on that bike.
Right.
And keep pedaling forward.
Yeah. And that's where that support system is so important.
Yeah. Having people who understand the struggle.
Right.
Who can offer encouragement and accountability.
Yeah.
It can make all the difference.
Huge difference. And it's not just about individual recovery either.
Right.
These stories also highlighted how addiction can impact relationships.
For sure.
They talked about the pain they cause their partners,
Right.
the betrayals, the challenges of rebuilding trust.
Yeah. It's a reminder that addiction doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Right.
It affects everyone in the addict's life.
It's a ripple effect.
Yeah.
So for those listening who are loved ones of people going through this,
Right.
it can be really hard to navigate those feelings of hurt, anger, betrayal.
It is.
But these stories give us hope that healing those relationships is possible
It is.
through honesty, open communication, and a commitment to change.
Absolutely.
Those broken bonds can be mended.
They can.
That's reassuring to hear.
Yeah.
I think it gives me hope that even after these really painful experiences,
Right.
there's possibility for forgiveness, growth, and reconciliation.
Absolutely. It's never too late to start on the path to healing,
Yeah.
both individually and in relationships.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into the world of SLAA,
Yeah.
what are some key takeaways for our listeners?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is that addiction can take many forms,
Yeah.
and it's never a sign of weakness or moral failing.
Right.
It's a complex condition that requires compassion and understanding.
And these stories really challenged any preconceived notions that I had about addiction.
Yeah.
It's not about making bad choices.
Right.
It's not about lacking willpower.
It's about pain.
Yeah.
It's a desperate search for relief.
Yeah. And whether we've personally experienced addiction or have loved ones who have these stories, offer a glimpse into the journey of recovery
Absolutely.
and the power of connection and support.
They remind us that healing is possible,
Yeah.
that we're not alone,
Right.
and that there's always hope for a brighter future.
Yeah. And for anyone struggling with sex and love addiction, or any form of addiction for that matter,
Right.
there are resources available.
There are.
SLA is just one example of a fellowship that offers a lifeline to those seeking recovery.
Exactly. And remember, taking that first step towards seeking help
Yes.
is often the most courageous act of all.
Absolutely. It's a sign of strength, not weakness.
Could not agree more.
All right, and that's a wrap for this deep dive into sex and love addiction. We hope you found this exploration insightful and thought-provoking.
We did.
And we will see you next time for another deep dive into a fascinating topic.
Can't wait.
Until then, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep growing.